Well, hello, welcome back to Intermediate Writing with Kent Lee here, Professor Kent Lee. Today we are going to look at a couple of sample articles in my book. They're sort of analyses articles, analyses is the plural of analysis. By the way, it's a Greek Latin pattern. Words in is become es in the plural. We are going to look at some examples of models or frameworks, and then sort of a problem solution type article. And these are sort of case studies also of businesses. And if you're not a business person, don't worry, because what we talk about in terms of these business examples will be relevant if you're doing something more academic, a more academic topic, or something more educational, like a case study of a particular school, department, program, or something like that. So the first example is sort of an example of a framework. So we need to explain some terminology here. Frameworks, models, and theories. So a framework is sort of a conceptual structure, sort of like a set of ideas that together form some kind of a system. In this case, some kind of a system for analyzing something, like for some kind of a set of ideas, a kind of a conceptual framework for example, analyzing a business case study, for analyzing a company or something a company has done. And it's kind of similar to a model. I'm actually not going to make a distinction really between models and frameworks. They kind of overlap a lot. So the example we have here on page 91, it's about Microsoft and Nokia. And you can see the framework, and it's kind of a framework for kind of evaluating the success of a merger or acquisition in terms of company culture. So you can see, like, it's got some criteria or categories you can look at. So a framework has often like some criteria or categories that you would look at and then apply to maybe a problem or a case that you're looking at. It's just a conceptual framework. Where do they get these particular criteria? I don't know. Maybe they just chose them because they seem to work. And whoever came up with this framework, maybe they've looked, they've studied mergers and acquisitions for years and years, and particularly from the standpoint of business culture. So for people looking at the business culture aspect of mergers, maybe they just identified these categories based on their experience. So framework may be kind of somewhat loose. It's maybe not entirely clear where they got these categories or these criteria, but it seems to work. Now, a model is kind of similar. It's kind of a framework for describing something, or maybe partially explaining something. So let's say if I have a model of like the sun and the earth, and the moon and Mars and the solar system. Okay, it's a simplified description because you can't look at the whole thing at once. It's a simplified description in a scale that you can see, and obviously it's not going to be an accurate depiction of the actual distances between these objects because the distances are huge. So you have a model, like maybe a plastic or foam model of these things, so you can better see and understand these things and you can describe them to someone else. A model provides maybe a simplified way of describing something, like a model of the solar system. And it provides some explanation. It provides some explanation of how these objects move around each other, like in these orbits on a flat plane. It provides some explanation. So a model is often a somewhat simplified description. It's a framework for describing, partly explaining, partly analyzing something. It's not intended to explain everything. When you get into more academic and scientific context, you will then talk about theories. And this is seriously misunderstood, what the word theory means. You have theory in this sort of colloquial or conversational sense. My theory is my English professor is an alien from another planet because he's very unusual. Okay, so that's more like a guess, a conjecture, a hypothesis. Scientifically speaking, it's not a theory. A theory is something different. And a theory can be something that's been proven. And it's not the same as a law. So for example, Isaac Newton came up with the law of gravity, or he identified the law of gravity. Boom, okay. That's gravity. And it's a thing. He came up with the law of gravity. Then there's the theory of gravity, which is an explanation for what causes gravity. A law is simply a simple statement. It could be a sentence, it could be a mathematical equation or formula. Newton discovered an exact mathematical description of gravity. How much is the force of attraction between two objects? And that's the famous law of gravity, which you learned in high school, hopefully if you paid attention in your science class. It's just a simple statement of, the mathematical relationship between the attraction between two objects. Newton could not explain what causes gravity. It wasn't until Einstein came along that Einstein came up with a theory. The theory of gravity is from Einstein, which kind of explains, well, what causes gravity? How does it work, at least on a large scale? Now, it's not complete. It doesn't explain how gravity works on a really small scale. It doesn't explain how gravity is related to other forces. But in terms of what Einstein was interested in, it's a complete theory of gravity at large scales. It attempts to fully explain gravity, what causes gravity, and how gravity is related to energy and space and time. So in terms of those questions, the theory answers a question. It explains something. So a theory is an explanatory framework. It explains something. What causes gravity? How is gravity related to space and time? And that's what the theory of gravity is, from Albert Einstein. It's been proven true. It's a true theory. In science, you care about proving whether a theory is true or not. Germ theory of disease, we know that it's been proven true. Infectious diseases are caused by germs, bacteria and viruses. And the germ theory explains how that happens. The theory of evolution has been proven true by genetics. For example, now in humanities, you talk about, let's say, literary theory. It's a framework, it's a set of principles, for example, for explaining how literature works, different genres of literature, how they work, how you interpret them, different kind of literary devices that are used in different genres of literature, how literature affects the reader, how the reader interacts with different kinds of literature. That's literary theory. Now, we're not trying to prove it true scientifically in the same way that you try to prove a scientific theory, but it's been accepted because it works. It kind of works for examining literature. So a theory is an explanatory framework. It's not the same as a law. It's not the case that a theory gets proven true and becomes a law. They're different things. Law of gravity is one thing. Theory of gravity, what causes that? That's just a different thing. The theory of gravity is a whole set of ideas. It's a set of statements and equations that explain what causes that to happen. It's an explanatory framework. So in this class, I'm not expecting you to really deal with any theories so much like for your final paper. I'm not necessarily expecting you to deal with any models or frameworks for your final paper. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. But I want you to understand what those are. A model or a framework is like a conceptual structure. It provides some explanation for something. It can describe something, provide some explanation for something. The example we're going to look at in a few minutes, in the article about Microsoft and Nokia, there's a particular framework here the author is using. It provides, in terms of the culture, the business culture, an explanation of why this failed from the standpoint of business culture. There are other reasons why it failed, but the article is just concerned with, well, within this framework, what can we understand about the failure of this acquisition here? There are other reasons too, but that's not the point. Just within this framework, we're interested in cultural explanations for this failure. So it's really important that you understand these terms, especially if you're in an academic field. Okay, so now let's look at the example. It's in my book right now, and it's on page 91 of the edition of my book that we're using this semester. And it deals with Microsoft and Nokia. So if you don't know Nokia, it was a big company in the early 2000s. It made mobile devices. First, they were famous for, I think, even the late 1990s. Before mobile phones or smartphones, we had a lot of business people use PDAs, which is like, imagine something that's like twice the size of a cell phone with these buttons you had to press by hand to send text, and that's about all it could do. But that was the best technology at the time, and a lot of business people loved those things, and Nokia was particularly famous for its PDAs, personal digital assistants. And then smartphones came along, and I think Nokia maybe was a little bit slow to move into that market, or they didn't do it as well, and they got kind of left behind by all the technological changes. And it was kind of at the time when mobile phones were coming out, smartphones, and Nokia was starting to fall behind and lose market share, that Microsoft paid about $7 billion to take over Nokia. So this article deals with the acquisition and merger of Nokia by Microsoft. So when one company acquires another, it might just leave it as a somewhat independent subsidiary, under it, or it might try to integrate the acquired company into itself, which is what Microsoft tried to do. They tried to just absorb Nokia into Microsoft as its mobile device division within Microsoft, and it didn't work very well. So this article is using a framework called the Synergies Framework for Mergers and Acquisitions. Now, even though I haven't really read about this particular framework, as I look at it, I can kind of see what it is. The different subheaders in this article are basically the different categories and criteria of this framework for examining mergers and acquisitions. And as you look at its criteria, you can see what it's for. Openness, feedback, mannerisms, leadership, decision-making, perceptions. You can see that and as you read through the article, you can see that this framework is mainly concerned with the cultural aspects, the business culture aspects of mergers and acquisitions. And the article goes through and, kind of in a very nice step-by-step fashion, applies each category or criterion of this framework to this case. And so first you get a little bit of background about the situation, and then step-by-step kind of analysis using this framework. Openness, cultural openness, and as it says, well, Nokia had some problems before the acquisition with management being open with communicating openly to employees, and then things got worse when Microsoft took over. Feedback. So it talks about cultural differences between Finnish people and Americans in terms of how you give feedback and praise in the workplace. And there were significant cultural differences here, led to problems when the Finnish people had to start working for Microsoft. There are very different mannerisms. It then talks about significant differences in kind of social, personal behavior, mannerisms, smiling, taking turns in conversation, silence, the use of silence in conversation and things like that. Leadership style, and how, for example, the more American top-down style was really not well suited for a Finnish context. And also the fact that just as Microsoft acquired Nokia, the Microsoft CEO responsible for this stepped down, and then the new Microsoft CEO was not interested in this, in Nokia or the mobile division into which Nokia was integrated, and that made things even worse. The Finnish people, the Nokia people, were kind of neglected. and eventually a lot of them got laid off, which made things worse. Again, the decision making is kind of similar. The process of decision making and the more top-down American style is very different from the more open Finnish style. Public perception, how the Finnish people were really not happy with their companies that they were proud of being taken over by Microsoft, and that caused problems too, that kind of doomed the success of this merger. So it's kind of a nice article. It's a fairly informal article. It's not terribly in-depth discussion. There are no sources cited. If a student were doing something like this in my class, I would want to see much more in-depth analysis and discussion and citing sources. But this is kind of a nice informal example of use of a framework or model for analyzing a particular case, a case study. And so these criteria or categories are basically criteria for evaluation. So this paper is kind of evaluative. It's evaluating the merger and acquisition of Microsoft and Nokia. So it's kind of an evaluative approach. It's evaluating something that's already been done. So evaluation, you maybe apply some criteria, some framework or model or theory to an existing situation, something that's happening now or something that happened in the past, and evaluate how well was it done, how well was it carried out, how effective was it, based on these business culture criteria. And that's the framework here. Okay, so this might give you some ideas for, this is maybe one way you might approach your final paper, your final topic. Another way might be sort of a problem solution here, and that's on page 96, and that is called background checks and their boundaries. And this is a little different because a lot of problem solution papers, you're looking at a current challenge, a current problem, you're analyzing it, and then you're proposing some recommendations or suggestions, solutions. Now this one is a bit different because it's retrospective. It's looking back at something that already happened, and it's kind of more evaluative also. It's evaluating how well something was done. Here was a problem, here's how the company chose to handle the problem, and then evaluate, kind of a brief evaluation of how effective that was. So with problem solution paragraphs, you usually introduce the topic and identify the problem or research question. Then you kind of develop arguments for your suggestions or recommendations, and what are the likely outcomes. And in this case, the topic is introduced, a little background on the company. The problem here is, well, this company needed to be able to do background checks on potential employees, job applicants, but it needed to do so in a way that was not too expensive and didn't violate their privacy rights. So in terms of the arguments, it's more like this is more retrospective. So this article looks at the different options that this company had. What were their different options? What were the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of different options? And you could do this for a current situation. Here's a challenge a company is facing. What are the different options? What are the pros and cons of the different options? And then which one is the best? You present arguments for which one is the best in your opinion. And that's how this article went. This is kind of an interesting read. Again, it's more informal. It doesn't cite sources very much. But it's kind of interesting, an interesting business case study. So it's kind of more retrospective, looking back at something that happened, more evaluative, evaluating what the company did. Was it the best choice? And according to the author, it seems to have been the best choice. And these are the positive results. As a result of their choice, how they chose to go about doing background checks, these are the positive results. These are the positive outcomes. And that's how, so how do you evaluate something? It could be according to some criteria, like in the article about Nokia. These are criteria you use to evaluate something. You can compare it with okay, this is how something usually is done. This is how mergers and acquisitions are usually done, how they usually work well. So you can compare it with, what's usually done. Or you look at the results. Were the results good? When you look at the results, does it seem like it was a good decision? Or if, for a current challenge or current situation that you're looking at, maybe a company is facing a current challenge, what are your recommendations? How do you argue the pros and cons? Again, you could look at a framework or model, say these are, according to these criteria or categories, this would be the best choice for this company or institute or organization. Or compare it with typical examples or other examples, and you compare this with successful examples or unsuccessful examples. Based on that, this would be the best course of action. It could be some in terms of like best practices, or look at the likely results. If these are the options, right now this company is facing these choices. They have like options A, B, and C. Well, what would be the results if it goes this way, if it chooses option A, this set of solutions, what would happen? And, maybe the results would not be so good or don't look so good. Option B, maybe the results would probably be okay, but option C, the results more likely would be good. And why do you say that? So there's different ways of maybe analyzing cases. Whether you are doing a company or you're doing some other topic, an academic topic, these are ways you could do your case study, and this might give you some ideas for your final paper. So for example, you could look at why a company has succeeded and grown so well. You could look at why a company failed or why it declined. You could look at, and these all could be past, present, or future. You could look at, well, a company's current, a particular strategy of a company. What's its strategy? Or its entry into a new marketplace, or maybe you think it should enter a new marketplace or do something different or shift its strategy. Programs, evaluation. So you could look at evaluating government agencies, government programs, educational programs, community service organizations, community service programs, a particular school, a particular university, a department at a particular university, or English departments at Korean universities in general. That might be okay if you can make it specific enough. These are different things that you could do for your final paper. So it could be more of a typical case study. It could be a program evaluation that would also fit the criteria of this assignment. Again, for any kind of business strategy, merger and acquisition, any kind of business activity, business partnership, some kind of organization, governmental or non-governmental organization, a charity organization, UNESCO, World Health Organization, World Bank, again, a particular school, a particular educational program, or there's so many things you could do. Whether your interests are more business or more academic or maybe more service oriented. These are ideas for how you might go about doing your final paper. So I hope this helps. In the upcoming lectures, again, we'll come back to a little bit about sources and different features of different kinds of papers, different kinds of text features. We'll get to that. More about case studies. We'll talk more about case studies a bit later on. And hopefully by now you know that there's a description of the final project and various assignments on the course website as well as in the LMS. So good luck as you start working on your final paper in this class. Hope you enjoy it. Hope you learn from it. And enjoy it, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.